Take a look at this disturbing footage. A girl steps into an elevator. Inside, she frantically presses the buttons, jumps out of the cabin, waves her hands around, and hides in the corner. A few minutes later, she vanishes from the frame. A few hours later, she vanishes completely. What happens next will become one of the most talked about internet investigations of the decade. Conspiracy theories, mysticism, rumors, all of it begins to multiply, feeding on new fragments and interpretations from armchair detectives and amateur investigators online. And it's not hard to understand why. The missing girl, named Elisa Lam, as the police would later confirm, walked into this building on January 31st, 2013, and never came out. But even with all that, this incident wouldn't have become so infamous if it hadn't been the first time something like this happened here. It wasn't. For nearly 90 years, this building has been home to serial killers, mysterious murderers, suicides, and unexplained disappearances. Because of the sheer number of deaths that took place inside its walls, the Cecil Hotel earned the chilling nickname, the Death Hotel. And in January of 2013, a 21-year-old student from Canada named Elisa Lam walked right into it. She had taken a bus from nearby San Diego and spent a few days in Los Angeles. Elisa behaved like any regular tourist visiting the City of Angels for the first time. On the day she disappeared, she went to a bookstore called The Last Bookstore, bought a few things, and worried out loud that they wouldn't all fit in her luggage. Later, an employee of the shop would recall her as polite and a little shy. That same evening, staff members spotted her in the lobby of the Cecil Hotel. A few hours later, she would appear in that elevator, in the very footage that would be discussed on forums for years. But that digital manhunt wouldn't start immediately. The now infamous video wouldn't be released online until 2 weeks after she disappeared. During that time, this happened. 7 days after Elisa went missing, the LAPD held a press conference, asking anyone with information about the whereabouts of a 21-year-old Canadian girl to come forward. A week earlier, she had suddenly stopped contacting her parents, even though up until that moment they had been speaking every single day. In the footage from that press conference, you can see her parents and sister standing behind the detectives. They had flown in from Toronto and had already been helping the police with the search for several days. Both the family and investigators expected the press conference to spark media attention. That didn't happen. In Canada, Elisa's case received far more coverage. But in Los Angeles, the disappearance of a lone woman, sadly, wasn't considered unusual. Local media quickly moved on to other stories, and her name quietly disappeared from the news cycle. But 1 week later, something happened that would make this case one of the most haunting mysteries of the decade. The LAPD released the elevator footage. The recording was made on February 1st, just after midnight. The 3 minutes and 59 seconds of footage are still easily found on YouTube to this day. Let's take a closer look. Elisa enters the elevator and begins pressing the buttons, or maybe multiple buttons at once. She leans forward slightly, which could be explained by the fact that she wore glasses and had poor eyesight, so she moves closer to see the panel more clearly. The first moment that really stands out happens around the 10-second mark. After a brief pause, Elisa slowly approaches the elevator doors and suddenly looks left and right, as if checking the hallway. Then she steps into the corner. At this point, it still looks like she simply saw someone outside, someone she might be hiding from. Another pause. Then she carefully steps out into the corridor. Around the 2-minute mark, things begin to feel a little more unsettling. Elisa Lam starts moving her hands in a strange, if not disturbing way. She stands in the hallway, and 2 minutes and 30 seconds after the recording begins, she disappears from the frame. The elevator footage quickly goes viral, gaining millions of views in just 10 days. And this was back in 2013. Getting 1 million views then was the equivalent to tens of millions today. And it's easy to understand why. The video feels like a horror film. Low budget, unpolished, but gripping. The realization that you're watching a real person who will vanish just hours later makes you scan every second of the footage. 5 days after the video appeared online, some of the hotel guests began complaining about low water pressure. A few even mentioned a strange taste and discoloration in the water. The first thing a hotel employee does in this situation is go to the roof. Up there are massive water tanks. A familiar sight for anyone who has seen rooftop photos from New York's older buildings. This outdated water system is rare outside New York, but the Cecil Hotel had the same setup. Huge water reservoirs on the roof. On February 19th, a staff member checks inside one of those tanks. News outlets immediately report that a body was found inside. 2 days later, police officially confirm that the body belongs to the missing girl, Elisa Lam. But in this story, the discovery of the body raises far more questions than her disappearance did. Here's what was known. There were no security cameras on the roof. The door wasn't locked, but according to hotel staff, it was alarmed. To remove the body, rescue workers had to cut open the tank from below. They couldn't pull her out through the top hatch. If this was a murder, someone would have had to disable the alarm, climb the ladder up to a 3-meter water tank, place the body inside, and do all of that without leaving a trace. If it was an accident, then the victim somehow did all of this alone and removed her clothes in the process. After the body was found, the online investigation exploded. That's when people started digging into the dark past of the Cecil Hotel, a place that, by then, many were already calling the Death Hotel. In early 2013, the Cecil Hotel building hadn't even reached its 100-year mark, and yet by that time, its name had already been linked to several high-profile crimes, along with dozens of other incidents that never made major headlines, but still contributed to its reputation as a cursed place. Suicides, mysterious disappearances, murders, and serial killers. It all sounds like a typical crime archive. It's only unsettling when you realize all of it happened in one single hotel. And before we move on to the deaths that made the Cecil infamous, we need to briefly look back at how this place came to be. The Cecil Hotel opened in 1924, right at the moment when Los Angeles was growing like wildfire and America was living through the Jazz Age, a time of confidence, excess, large sunlit windows facing the Southern California light, and the perfect location, right next to the city's main railway terminal and the Central streetcar line. From here, you could travel to almost any part of Los Angeles, which is why the hotel quickly attracted business travelers, salesmen, journalists, tourists, and dreamers who came to California to make a life. But just 5 years later, everything began to change. The Wall Street crash and the Great Depression turned what was once a prestigious district into a gray zone of survival. Main Street, where the hotel stood, slowly filled with tents of the homeless, cheap hostels, and open street drug trade. Then things got even worse. The Central Station was relocated, streetcar lines were shut down, and the rise of the automobile era stripped Cecil of its last advantage. The hotel had no parking, and it suddenly found itself cut off from the new Los Angeles, a city that now lived on freeways and cleaner neighborhoods. A building that was created for the elite ended up surrounded by Skid Row, a place where a person can disappear without a trace and without a question asked. The hotel's management realized the wealthy would never return, and so the Cecil stopped being a hotel for travelers. It became a home for those who had nowhere else to go, for the dependent, the runaway, the lost. From that moment, the hotel stopped being just an address. It became a container of human despair. And everything that happened next, the murders, the suicides, the serial killers, the disappearances, was not a matter of paranormal mystery. It was the natural consequence of an environment where no one is responsible for anyone. The first recorded suicide of the hotel was in 1927, when Percy Ormond Cook shot himself in the head after falling out with his wife and child. In 1930, a man called W.K. Norton killed himself by taking poison pills. And the year after that, a man died after being pinned against the wall by a truck at the rear entrance. In 1934, one Louis Borden committed suicide by slashing his own throat with a razor. Then in 1937, guests started jumping out of the windows. That year, Grace Margot was found on the sidewalk in front of the hotel with telephone cables wrapped around her, dead. No one could be sure if she leapt or accidentally fell from her room on the 9th floor. Apparently, her companion, a young sailor, was asleep at the time and could shed no light. The year after that, a man was found dead on the roof of the building next door, and investigators surmised that he'd jumped from the Cecil too. A few years later, a woman called Margaret Brown exited her room via the window, landed on the hotel marquee, dying a short while later. Not surprisingly, by then, the Cecil had become known as the Suicide Hotel. Arguably, the worst suicide was in 1962, when Pauline Otten and George Giannini were both found dead on the sidewalk in front of the Cecil. The LAPD assumed they'd made a pact before leaping from her 9th floor room. However, a skeptical medical examiner pointed out that Giannini was still wearing his shoes, which should have been an impossibility since they would have been thrown off by the force of impact of a 100-foot fall. It turned out upon further investigation that poor Giannini was just minding his own business, walking down the street, when he was hit by Otten dropping from the sky onto him. The last thing she did while alive was commit murder. And needless to say, the Hotel Cecil has also seen more than its fair share of murders. In 1964, Goldie Osgood, who was known as the Pigeon Lady because she kept some of the birds in a cage on the roof, was found robbed, raped, and strangled in her room. Police later arrested a man who was seen walking around the neighborhood, covered in blood, but later cleared him. The article didn't say whose blood the man was covered in because it wasn't his own. Osgood's murderer was never found. Perhaps, more surprisingly, the hotel has absolutely no connection to Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, although locals will often claim that she spent time there. For some people, I guess, the Cecil hadn't been involved in enough death and crime. They have to connect it to every unsolved murder in Los Angeles. Serial killers also checked into this hotel. In the 1980s, Richard Ramirez moved into the Cecil. The world would later know his name as the Night Stalker. Ramirez committed nearly 24 brutal crimes and kept Los Angeles in fear for over a year. After each murder, he reportedly returned to the Cecil Hotel. But back then, in the chaos of that building, nobody paid attention to a strange man covered in dirt and blood. In 1991, another killer checked in, Johann Unterweger, an Austrian journalist who came to Los Angeles supposedly to write about crime in the city. He stayed at the Cecil and often went on ride-alongs with LAPD patrols. Later, it turned out that he used those patrols to choose his victims. A few years later, he was sentenced to life in prison for multiple murders of sex workers. In total, at least 16 violent deaths took place inside the hotel over a span of 90 years. All of this only fueled the obsession of internet investigators, who were convinced of one thing. Elisa Lam was murdered. Everyone was waiting for updates from the police. The detectives stayed silent. After a few weeks, even the media lost interest in Elisa Lam's case. In that information vacuum, users on forums began to highlight every strange detail they could find. One of those details was tuberculosis. Around the same time Elisa disappeared, there was a tuberculosis outbreak in the area surrounding the Cecil. Nobody would have connected the two events if not for one eerie coincidence. The test that was used to detect the outbreak was called Lam Elisa, exactly the same as her name. People online immediately drew comparisons to the horror film Dark Water, the Hollywood remake of a Japanese psychological thriller. In that story, a woman and her daughter move into an old building. The elevator is broken. Dark, dirty water comes from the tap, and they investigate the source. They discover the body of a missing girl inside a water tank on the roof. Many people online insisted that the hotel itself had something to do with Elisa Lam's death. Cecil is cursed, they wrote. By 2013, the hotel was doing everything it could to maintain an image. The owners marketed it as a boutique hotel, and while most of the rooms were still rented out to low-income residents of the district, a portion operated like a 2-star hotel. Good service didn't matter. The price did. To distance itself from its past, the Cecil even changed its name. It was rebranded as Stay on Main. That is the name under which Elisa Lam booked her room. With the full story in mind, it becomes clear that it wasn't ghosts or paranormal forces that created Cecil's reputation. It was the people who stayed there. There was no dark energy in the building, only neglected lives and desperate tenants. As for the tuberculosis test, any epidemiologist would tell you that Lam Elisa is simply a standard abbreviation used in diagnostics. Nothing more. Almost 6 months after her disappearance, the police finally released the findings of the investigation. The official cause of death was ruled as drowning, with bipolar disorder listed as a contributing factor. Psychiatrists agreed with that conclusion. To them, Elisa's behavior in the elevator was a clear display of psychosis. Pressing multiple buttons, looking for someone who wasn't there, making erratic hand movements. During the investigation, it was revealed that Elisa had been prescribed medication for bipolar disorder. She had been struggling at university, and according to her blog, she hoped that a trip along the West Coast would help her reset her mind and escape her mental state. The coroner's report confirmed that her body was found completely naked. The clothing, matching what she wore in the elevator footage, was floating nearby in the water, covered in fine sand-like particles. Elisa's body was moderately decomposed and bloated. Her skin had taken on a greenish tint, with marbling visible on the abdomen. There were no signs of physical trauma, no indication of sexual assault, and no marks consistent with suicide. All of this was officially recorded in the reports. Toxicology tests showed traces of prescription medication, the same drugs that were found among her belongings, as well as over-the-counter medicines like Sinutab and ibuprofen. A very small amount of alcohol, around 0.02%, was detected in her system, not enough to affect behavior. However, experts noticed something else. The concentration of her prescription medication was abnormally low, suggesting that Elisa had either been under-medicating or had stopped taking her medication shortly before her disappearance. Her behavior prior to her death also raised questions. When she checked into the Cecil, Elisa Lam was initially assigned a shared room on the 5th floor. But after just 2 days, her roommates complained about what hotel attorneys would later describe as odd behavior. Amy Price, the Cecil's manager at the time, later recalled that Elisa had been leaving notes for her roommates that said, "Go home" and "Go away." She would lock the door and demand a password before allowing anyone inside. Just a few days before she disappeared, Elisa attended a live taping of Conan O'Brien in Burbank. According to witnesses, she was escorted out by security due to disruptive behavior during the recording. But none of this satisfied the online investigators, who continued to look for something darker, even years later. And to be fair, there were reasons to question the official version. To this day, no one can say for certain, how did Elisa manage to get onto the roof at all? How did she climb a massive water tank with no ladder access? And why was her body found without clothes?